Japan's dominance of the gaming industry has been incredible. They have some of the best game developers such as Nintendo, Sony, Sega, Bandai Namco, Konami, Square Enix, and more. Now, in order to understand how this happened, we need to go back in time and look at the effects that the Second World War had on Japan and how its economic growth coincided with the rise of video games, therefore creating one of the biggest industries in the world, with Japan being in the centerpiece of it all. Gaming is one of the fastest growing industries in the world, and it all started in 1958 after a physicist by the name of William Higginbotham wanted to entertain a group of college students which were visiting the nuclear laboratory he was working at. And it only took a few hours to program the first video game. The name of the game was Tennis for Two. It was a very basic game, and the controller looked like the first house I built in Minecraft, so it's fair to say that the ergonomics were not considered when making the controller. However, it wasn't bad at all for a game only made in a couple of hours. For a long period of time, there was little to no evolution for video games. The only notable game to release was Space War in 1962, and it was another cool thing, but it didn't rock the world. However, in 1972 there was a breakthrough. A game by the name of Pong was created. It was a very simple game, but the technology got better and became more accessible, meaning that the game was fun and easy to pick up. Therefore, thousands of people became interested, and it didn't take that long for even more people to catch on, so thousands became millions in a space of a few years. Atari has done it. They created the first game that captured some serious attention worldwide. Gaming was on its way up. 1972 was also the year when the first console was made. The Magnavox Odyssey was created by Magnavox, obviously, but they were a subsidiary of Philips, and the console was more of an experiment than anything else. However, with the success of Pong, Atari have gained a lot of funds and decided to heavily invest into their research and development. While Magnavox gave up on making consoles, Atari's R&D seemed to have paid off when the Atari 2600 was released in 1977, establishing itself as the most popular console at the time. And that wasn't the only Japanese company establishing its dominance, since in 1978 Space Invaders was being released and it became the highest grossing game at the time. In fact, it was the first game to make over $1 billion. However, with the spike of popularity, Taito, the developers of the game, could not keep up with the demand. Everybody loved the game, and the people were willing to wait hours in queues just to play Space Invaders. It's fair to say that the game has built up a large audience, and it broke many records along the way. So, in 1980, Space Invaders was available on the Atari 2600. This was a win for all the parties involved. The developers could get a good sum of money for every copy sold. Atari was being satisfied because the game drove more sales for the console, and of course the people could just play their favorite game from the comfort of their homes, which was a very different thing at the time. The progress made in the last 10 years in the gaming industry was incredible. At the start of the decade, no game has even made $1 million in sales. Now, we're talking about billions of dollars. These figures are truly incredible, and it truly did foreshadow how big gaming was going to become. The 1980s were further proof that gaming was still growing. When Pac-Man released in 1980, there were even more people who were introduced into the world of gaming, and as of today, Pac-Man franchise generated over $14 billion in revenue. Not too long later, there was a toy company that previously made cards that took a big leap of faith into the gaming industry. They had a vision that gaming will be a big part of entertainment. And after a few successful releases, Nintendo were ready to step it up, and in 1983 they released the NES. With competitive hardware and an attractive price of $179, which would be just under $500 today, making it a great deal compared to the other alternatives, that sounded very good. But what games could you play on it? So, with this great console, an iconic game was released alongside it, with one of the most recognizable faces of all time. The timing was perfect, since millions of people wanted to play a new game, but they were slightly bored of the previous games, and platformers were still very fresh at the time. In addition, many other developers were putting their games on the NES, therefore you had access to thousands of games on that console. However, Mario and the NES were not one-trick ponies. In fact, they were just warming up. And that's because in 1986, a game that was set to conquer all of our hearts and childhoods was released. The Legend of Zelda was the proof that Nintendo can make good games with varied genres and on a consistent basis. This made Nintendo a household name, and it became a threat to their competition. Let's keep in mind that all the companies I have mentioned so far are Japanese. Some of these brands are iconic to gaming, and there are many more examples. And all of this got me wondering why it was the Japanese developers that became the pioneers of video games, and how did they manage to dominate this industry? While some of you may say it's the exception to the rule, or just luck, I would disagree. And that's because I believe that there is something about Japan that made these companies evolve quickly and become giants of the industry. Success is not luck, after all. In order to understand this fully, we need to go back in time to Japan in September 1945. The World War II has just ended, and every country wanted to rebuild their economy. And Japan managed to do that very well, although losing 25% of their total wealth after the war. Japan's GDP per capita rose by 7.1% on average from 1945 to 1956, whereas the average for the rest of the world was at roughly 3 to 4%. If you don't know what GDP per capita is, it's the best way we can measure the standard of living, so the higher it is, the better the standard of living is. Obviously, you do that after considering the inflation. And it's fair to say that Japan was extremely well off at the time. Considering that the percentages do compound, you could really see those numbers adding up after 11 years. Japan ended up growing their economy by roughly 70% in total when it comes to their standard of living, with inflation considered. For comparison, the average net growth in the standard of living was around 20%. That's an astronomical difference. With this amazing growth, the Japanese citizens had a better quality of life, more free time, and of course, more money to spend. And usually, that money would go to stabilizing yourself and your family, buying cars and real estate, as well as spending some of that money on entertainment, of course. Films and movies were of course a big part of the Japanese entertainment, but that was not good enough. Some of the people were just getting bored of films, since they existed for over 50 years, and gambling did exist, however it was very restricted, which made it less accessible across the whole of Japan. With that in mind, millions of people across Japan were looking for different ways to entertain themselves. And that's when we got the demand for a new source of entertainment, since video games seemed to have ticked all the boxes, and initially we got them in the form of arcades. The reason for that was in the 1970s the technology has advanced enough to make arcades easily accessible, hence why millions became interested, meaning that a lot of money was involved as well. Therefore, it didn't take long for other companies to notice and start getting involved in the gaming industry themselves. The arcade hype was real in Japan, and arcades are still very popular in Japan, well, at least before COVID. However, there was a certain company that saw the potential in arcades, and they were certainly betting big on gaming. Sega innovated arcades in Japan. They were phenomenal. The arcades were so successful that they created Sega World, which was just a huge multi-floor building filled to the brim with Sega games and arcades. But good things have to come to an end. Arcades may have not been enough, and better hardware was releasing, and the bulky frame of arcades didn't help either. So Sega had to change. In 1988, Sega took a risk. They have created a console to rival their competition. They didn't want to rely on arcades anymore, hence why they released the Mega Drive, aka the Sega Genesis. And if you knew something about video games back then, this name would ring a bell for sure. Sega was finding good success with the Genesis, but it wasn't enough to swing at the juggernauts of the industry, because they were missing a console seller. They didn't have someone like Mario as an icon of their franchise. That was the case until 1991. In 1991, a platforming sensation that was able to rival the Mario franchise was born. Sega was rolling around at the speed of sound to success after the release of Sonic. This was the perfect jewel on the crown for Sega, and it was a reason for people to keep purchasing Sega consoles at the time. And this era of dominance did not stop there. There were multiple amazing companies coming from Japan, and another worthy inclusion is Konami. While you may not think about Konami as one of the biggest developers today, they were certainly making moves in the late 80s. In 1986, Konami created Castlevania. It was a different type of game at the time, and it still manages to feel somewhat unique as of today. The Castlevania franchise sold over 3.7 million copies by 1993 and over 20 million copies by 2006. And just a year later, in 1987, Konami released Mega Man. The franchise had frequent releases, with Mega Man 2 being released in 1988, selling 1.5 million units, and that's before gaming was mainstream. In total, the Mega Man series sold over 38 million units as of today. These are incredible figures. It's pretty obvious why Konami was a prospering company and establishing itself as the titan of the industry. But surely, this success from previously mentioned companies did have to stop at some point. Surely someone had to stop them, or at least provide some serious competition, especially that the Cold War ended in 1991. Therefore, many countries were focusing on their economy again. But we may have underestimated how much of an advantage the Japanese game developers had, since they had over a decade worth of experience developing video games, as well as researching some of the newest technologies, and that will get you one step ahead of everyone else. So, when the SNES released in 1990, it lacked competition, and in 1994, Sega tried to rival Nintendo by releasing Sega Saturn. And you probably know the catastrophe that the Sega Saturn was, therefore the release of Nintendo 64 in 1996 would have been unrivaled, right? Competition was not coming from the Americas or the EU. In fact, it was another rival also coming from Japan, and they came in hot to disrupt the console wars. The PlayStation was released and it had the funding of Sony behind it. Therefore, they were able to invest in research and developments in order to dominate in 3D graphics. And it seemed to have paid off, since it was the best 3D console at the time and it sold over 100 million units. Not a bad debut at all. But was this enough to dominate the market? Was the PlayStation a one-trick pony? Sony had to prove themselves. And so they did. In 2000, Sony created a monster of a console, generating 158 million sales, which is the most sales of any console ever. What else do you need to know? You probably owned or played on the PlayStation 2 at some point. You know what it's all about, the amazing game collection the console had, the groundbreaking levels of 3D graphics at the time, and everything about the console was pretty much flawless. All the games and consoles seem to have been dominated by the Japanese developers, and after many years, nobody was able to dethrone them. But remember, Rome wasn't built in a day. During the late 90s and early 2000s, there were many prospering developers, which were yet to enter their prime. Some of my favorite games, like Worms Armageddon, released in 1999, was made by a British developer called Team 17. Also, the Rayman franchise is one of my favorites, and it was made by Ubisoft in the late 90s as well. And who could forget this iconic game released by Rockstar in 2004? Some of the greatest hits were now getting released by others. In addition, the original Xbox was released in 2001 and it had an incredible debut for a console, with almost 25 million sales. In fact, the GameCube was released in 2001 as well, and it only mustered just over 21 million sales in comparison. Suddenly, there's an influx of great games and consoles coming from the Western world. Could the Japanese developers finally be overthrown? Were they just lucky to capitalize on an undersaturated market? Well, after 5 years of success with Sony, the developers of Crash Bandicoot, Naughty Dog, were acquired by Sony in 2001. Keep in mind that they were a studio based in America. Naughty Dog definitely gained the respect of Sony, and they wanted to work together instead of being enemies. Therefore, this roughly marks the start where the rest of the world was rivaling Japanese developers. But what about Nintendo? You may have noticed that I did not mention the Game Boy at all so far, although it was very successful. After the original was released in 1989, the Game Boy Color was released in 1998. Just adding color to a handheld device in 9 years was not enough. And of course, great games also came. However, the lack of hardware change did limit Nintendo's design choices for their video games, but that's when Nintendo did what they are best at and evolved. In 2004, Nintendo's R&D has finally paid off, after they were able to make the Nintendo DS. That's when Nintendo was starting to release their best games onto their handheld consoles. It's clear that Nintendo did not want to compete on the hardware side. It made sense, since you can sell more games than consoles, and most consoles did not even have a good profit margin. So Nintendo decided to focus on releasing a console with over a decade of support, and they put some of the most iconic games to ever exist on it. They made it appeal to the casual audiences, gaining even more customers, and all of this was done on the reskin of the Nintendo GameCube. Nintendo launched the Wii, which had the same hardware as the GameCube, and it was actually more expensive at launch. How the heck did Nintendo pull this off? Simple, they just marketed it well and released some of the best games to ever exist on the Nintendo Wii. The console broke over 100 million units sold, and there were so many iconic games released on the console that it would take hours to go through them all. So the memories made on the Nintendo Wii and the Nintendo DS were almost endless for many. They truly revolutionized gaming and made it even more mainstream. But times were changing. With the PSP disaster in 2005 and the catastrophic launch of the PlayStation 3 in 2006, Sony were unable to dominate the industry, and Nintendo was not competing in the same ballpark anymore. So, in the late 2000s and early 2010s, the rest of the world had a few decades to catch up to the Japanese developers for software and hardware. Let's have a look at some of the stats then. The Xbox 360 was also an amazing console, making the PlayStation 3 almost irrelevant during the late 2000s. The damage was done, and the Xbox did win the console wars, for the conventional consoles at least. Although the PS3 at the very end of its lifetime managed to actually outsell the Xbox 360 oddly enough. And the less said about Nintendo the better. To cut it short, the Wii U, released in 2012, was a disaster, selling 13.5 million copies, which is the second worst selling console for Nintendo, after the Virtual Boy. Yeah, that says a lot. It was crystal clear that the Japanese games and console developers were not one step ahead anymore. The playing field was leveled. The games made by the Japanese developers were not bad, but it seemed like the games made by others just outnumber and overwhelm them. At the time, the Japanese developers could not rival games like GTA 5, Red Dead Redemption 2, Doom, Celeste, Stardew Valley, Hollow Knight, Minecraft, The Witcher 3, Forza Horizon and more. Many brilliant games were being released at the time, and it was hard to compete against it all. There was plenty of variety between these games as well, and some of the games were made by indie developers with a very small team or even a solo developer. In addition, multiplayer games were the new trend as well, so games like Overwatch, at the beginning at least, Call of Duty, Borderlands became super popular, and let's not forget the hype that Battle Royales got with the releases of PUBG and Fortnite. Furthermore, sports games were also a big deal, with the best example being FIFA, a franchise which generates over $1 billion per year. It's fair to say it's a successful game, although most people would say that it's not even a good game in the first place. So, what was the response from the Japanese studios and developers? After seeming like the ones falling behind now, Sony came up back roaring with some of the best exclusives, with a good console to go alongside it. The PS4 sold over 117 million units, and for a good reason. The console was more affordable than the Xbox One, and Sony's multi-billion-dollar bet on acquiring studios for a strong lineup of exclusives has paid off. God of War, Uncharted, The Last of Us, Horizon Zero Dawn, and Ghost of Tsushima were all exceptionally good games. On top of that, getting the exclusive rights to the releases of Final Fantasy VII Remastered and Spider-Man were brilliant moves as well. Sony was back in the game. And of course, there were a lot more Japanese developers that did well at the time, such as Square Enix with Final Fantasy, Nier Automata, Dragon Quest, and Kingdom Hearts. Bandai Namco also did well, and From Software was making serious moves with the Dark Souls franchise, Bloodborne, and Sekiro Shadows Die Twice. But what about our friend Nintendo? What were they up to? And the answer is simple, they were evolving. So, with the rise of mobile games in the late 2000s and early 2010s, the industry got exposed to so many new people willing to play video games. And let's just say that mobile games took over in Asia like a rocket, similarly to how arcades took over in Japan. Armed with that knowledge, the developers knew that they had to adapt to the situation. Although you may not know many of these games, there are plenty of mobile game hits in Asia making a crazy amount of money. This is also how Tencent got so popular so quick, and they were armed with a war chest with a budget of billions, and they were ready to conquer the rest of the world. A part of the reason why mobile games got so large so quick was because of accessibility, especially after you consider that phones were accessible to people even in second and third world countries in the 2010s. This made gaming possible to everyone. There was no entry fee for gaming anymore. There are plenty of other reasons which I may cover at a later date, but for the purposes of this video, that's all we need to know. Later on, more amazing Nintendo games came over, such as Super Mario Odyssey, Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, and many more amazing titles. While some of these games were initially made for the Wii U, not many people got to play these games because they didn't get the Wii U. As you remember, it only got 13.5 million sales. So these games were treated as new games for most people. But this was not just a simple handheld. That's not where the evolution stops. It ain't a one-trick pony. The Nintendo Switch was not the most powerful console, but the functionality of it was truly unique. It's the first true hybrid console. The console was designed in a very smart manner. It's easy to understand how millions of dollars worth of research and development actually impacted the end product. You probably should know all of its functionalities, because you either have it or at least know plenty about it. But how successful is the Switch? How does it compare to the other top-selling consoles? Well, right now, the Switch is at over 109 million sales and still counting. And it's been released 5 years ago, so there is still room for growth. Right now, the Switch is sitting at the 5th place for the most selling consoles of all time, and it's breathing on PlayStation's Forest neck for the number 4 spot, and it's not even far away from the Game Boy either, which is at number 3. I did talk a lot about consoles in this video because you need consoles to sell your games on, and of course mobile phones and PCs do exist, but you would still be missing out on huge segments of the market by disregarding consoles, especially in the earlier days, since it was their natural evolution from arcades. To sum it up, due to Japan's economic advantage compared to the rest of the world, they managed to get ahead from the rest of the world and they kept innovating on their games and consoles, staying one step ahead until now at least. So, what's next? Well, the PlayStation 5 is looking good, Sony's exclusives seem even stronger, but the consoles seem to be less relevant by the decade. And that's where Xbox has an advantage. They have a huge lineup of games in the Game Pass. They spent over $7.5 billion for Bethesda to get rights to games like Doom, The Elder Scrolls, Fallout, Wolfenstein, and Dishonored. And even more recently, Xbox have made a groundbreaking buyout of Activision, worth $68.7 billion. But why is the Game Pass so important? Well, it does look like we are moving towards cloud-based gaming, where you don't need consoles or any dedicated hardware. Also, you'd be able to loan games instead of buying the games for their full price, in the same way you could watch all the films on Netflix, for example. This is a perfect setup from Xbox to dominate the gaming industry. However, Sony is trying to compete on that end now, investing a lot of money into acquiring even more studios and getting the infrastructure set up for that future. With that in mind, Nintendo, Sony, Square Enix, Bandai Namco, From Software and others do still have an incredible lineup of games, so they have the right cards, it just depends how they will play them out. The only major wildcard in the playing field is Nintendo, since we have no idea what's next for them. The games can be good, but it would be nice if a good handheld came along with it. But it's going to be a challenge to innovate on the Nintendo Switch. Looking at Nintendo's past, we may expect them to focus on AR technology, which brings the virtual world to us, unlike the rest who are focusing on bringing us to the virtual world. Therefore, Nintendo looks good, as long as they can execute their plans, since they will be able to offer something unique that nobody else can do. And let's not forget about Valve. I know that I didn't mention them much, but they have released a Steam Deck and developed Half-Life Alyx, which is a VR game. Clearly, they are trying to make some moves as well. So now, it's over to you. Make sure to share your thoughts in the comments about your take on this topic, and also let me know what other topics you would like me to cover. Any feedback is appreciated, and thank you for watching the video. Stay epic, gamers.